So my name is Emma DeSouza, and I'm a citizens' rights campaigner, best known for reaffirming the identity and citizenship provisions of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. I took a 5-year court case against the British Home Office to establish my Good Friday Agreement right to be accepted as Irish. And after a very long and lengthy legal case, we did secure legislative changes in the United Kingdom to immigration law that means all the people of Northern Ireland will be considered EU citizens for immigration purposes. In other areas of my work, I also deal with voting rights, and I'm a campaigner that works on issues to do with the Good Friday Agreement across Northern Ireland. In terms of considering the future of the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, it's not something that I would have often thought of or considered. It's something that has become more relevant with time, especially in the context of Brexit. I wouldn't define myself as someone that has always aspired for a united Ireland or who has always been trying to campaign for one, but I do believe that the island of Ireland should be unified, and I think that that future can, of course, be shared under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement.
And what does that mean in practical terms? How would that work out in terms of governance?
I mean, in terms of governance, it's for that's to be defined. I think the most important thing right now is having discussions on what that future would look like. When you look at how the Good Friday Agreement was created in Northern Ireland, you can see that it took a long time to get that text together, and then every household on the island of Ireland was given a copy of the agreement, which was deliberately written in a way that was easy for people to digest so they understood what they were voting for. When I think about the possible constitutional changes of this island, I think a similar plan has to be done when it comes to discussing how would it work. And that involves having to have very lengthy discussions. A citizens' assembly would be a good starting point in discussing, well, how would that look in terms of governance?
What would be the point of it if unionists don't participate in it? Citizens' assembly, for instance?
Well, I mean, I'd like to think that unionists would participate. I think that people can often fall into the trap of describing unionists and indeed nationalists as some sort of one entire body of a community, when in reality there are very many different degrees of unionists and nationalists. It's a very varied group. There are ones that are more liberal, more moderate, and there's also a misconception that unionists all of them voted to leave in the referendum on the EU, which is of course not true. Many voted to remain. So I do think that there are plenty of people within unionism that would engage.
You mentioned the EU and the Brexit referendum, but are you not guilty of conflating the two things as well? Because just because someone in North Down votes to remain within the EU, for example, I'm quoting an actual example here in my head, who was vehemently pro-EU, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be voting to leave the Union with the UK either.
I believe that the point I'm trying to make is that there are a variety of views within each political ideology. So the argument that all of unionism will not engage in the discussion is a fallacy in itself, because within unionism, there are people that will be willing to engage. And I believe that to be true.
How could the Republic absorb a society which exists on 10 billion a year from the UK Treasury?
Well, we could look at Germany as a good example. There's, of course, no doubt that initially, in the short term, there would be a financial burden placed on Irish taxpayers. But the degree to which that financial burden would impact people would, of course, be dependent on how much funding might be available from the EU or other outside institutions that might be willing to help soften the blow of that financial burden. And then, of course, it would take time to bring these two separate economies together, as it did, of course, with Germany. And I think that that's a good place to look in terms of how we can try and make that work. It took decades for Germany's two economies to come together. I'd expect the same thing to happen here in the island of Ireland. That doesn't mean it's not possible. And I think today you would find very few Germans that would say the cost was not worth it. We can spend a lot of time discussing instances in the past where identity was not respected, or where there were people that were not respectful to other communities. But I think the future is more important, and building that understanding is what the majority of people want. There will always be a minority that do not want to have a rights-based future, which is why so many rights-based provisions of the Good Friday Agreement have not been fully implemented. But thankfully, there is a majority of people that are looking to build a rights-based future for everyone here that works for everyone, and I think that that's what will win out.
Speaking of winning out, when would you like to see a border poll?
I think my biggest concern is that a border poll would be called without the preparation that's required for it to be successful. It took Scotland 2 years to establish a plan for what an independent Scotland would look like. But I actually think a plan for the island of Ireland would take a lot longer because there's a lot more to digest here and a lot more to work on. So I think for me, you really would need to spend years establishing a very detailed plan on healthcare, on the economy, on pensions, on education. All these aspects would need to be worked out in advance. I don't think that it would be appropriate for there to be a border poll called in the next 5 years. I would, however, be keen to see one called in 7 to 10 years.
What will happen to governance, power, parliaments? What will happen to Stormont?
Yeah, it's a big question, and I think a citizens' assembly would be a very good place to start ironing out what people think that should look like. There are some good arguments to be had over whether there should be some sort of governance from Stormont, even for a transitionary period, for 7 years or 10 years. But I think that from a personal perspective, Stormont, at least how it operates now, hasn't worked. Since the assembly was established, it's collapsed 5 times, and a lot of the progress we would like to have seen in the last 2 decades just hasn't happened. It's been held back by divisive politics. I don't know if that's a result of mandatory coalition and whether voluntary coalition might have more success, but currently as it is, the assembly, in my view, does not work. And so in a unified Ireland, if it was maintained the way it is now, I don't think that would be beneficial to anybody. But in terms of whether there should be reform and considerations as to there being some kind of power remaining at Stormont, even for a transitionary period, that's a conversation I would enter into.
But ultimately, the power will lie in Dublin, is what you're saying.
Well, the power ultimately still lies in Westminster. The devolved institutions actually, they continue to lose power if we look at some of the recent legislation that's been brought forward. So I think that ultimately, yes, that power should eventually, even maybe with a transitionary period, should lie in Dublin.
That's hardly going to appeal to a lot of unionists, though, is it?
I mean, if they have representation, I don't see why it would necessarily be a gas to anybody. Politics does have its part to play, but key here is civic society and community-based leaders. And I think that it will emerge that community-based leaders and civic society will lead the conversation on any kind of change to our constitutional future. And I think that's where it should lie. I think we should separate the two.
It could be argued, and you'll obviously want to counter this, but the theory goes, but by talking up all this need for a border poll, that's divisive, that's stirring the pot, that's making divisions even worse.
I don't agree with that. I think framing the conversation of a border poll as divisive is entirely wrong. And I say that because it's entirely legitimate for people to talk about the change of the constitutional future of this island. It's legitimate under the Good Friday Agreement, and it's legitimate under the Irish Constitution. We are free to pursue our want of a change in Ireland, and that is not something that should ever be painted as divisive. It's not divisive for someone to talk about them wanting to remain in the Union. So why should it be seen as divisive for those of us that want to aspire for a better and a new unified Ireland be seen as divisive? I don't think that it's fair nor representative of the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. I think that conversations have changed, and those that are trying to say it hasn't aren't really listening, because in terms of since the Brexit referendum, the two are distinct, but you can't really say that there hasn't been an increase in people talking about the possibility of constitutional change. And I think that that does stem from the fact that Northern Ireland voted to remain. And since then, much of the impact of Brexit on this region has, our voices haven't really been listened to. Well, there are many people in Northern Ireland who would not agree with that assessment that Northern Ireland is financially benefiting from being part of the United Kingdom. In fact, many of the areas that were most impacted by the Troubles continue to have severe poverty. So I don't think that we can say that this is a successful society and that financially it's beneficial for people. And as I say, the healthcare system is buckling. It's in crisis mode at the moment. So I do think that there are opportunities to be had in discussing what a new Ireland can look like and seeing if we can't make the healthcare system better for both North and South. See if we can't make the benefit system better for people North and South. See if we can't make rights-based a rights-based society that operates for all citizens, north and south. For me, I actually think that talking about changing the constitutional status of this island benefits all citizens of this island, not even just those of us who are Irish and British, but also migrants and those from other communities who are underrepresented. I think that it's an exciting opportunity that should be examined.